Hello, I'm Deputy Foreign Editor Albert Wai, and welcome to Asian Insider. This episode is on the war in the Middle East, the good, the bad, and the ugly from China's perspective. We will be unpacking what the war in Iran means for Beijing in terms of foreign policy, economic ties, as well as from the military perspective. I'm happy to team up again with ST's senior China correspondent Yew Lun Tian. She is in the field and has been juggling the reporting for China's 2 sessions parliamentary meetings, the Boao Forum for Asia, which is happening this week, as well as the possible summit between Mr. Donald Trump and Mr. Xi Jinping, which we now hope will happen over the next couple of months.
Hey Albert, thanks for having me. Big hello to everyone from sunny Hainan.
I know that it is nice and sunny on Hainan Island where you are based right now, but in another part of the world, we are seeing very different things in the Middle East, right? When one talks about war, the focus is often on the fallout, the collateral damage, and then hopes for peace. On the surface, observers might say that China had limited leverage on the proceedings so far, and its reliance on oil from the Middle East has put it in a position of disadvantage. What we will do, however, is to approach this from a slightly different perspective. So I will ask Lun Tian if there might be a silver lining in all this for Beijing. To be clear, we are not saying that the conflict has benefited China. Over 3,000 people have died in the Middle East. There has been military spending in excess of US $15 billion and fuel shortages in many countries. The Chinese government had to step in to limit the increase in fuel prices domestically. So there can be no actual winner in this. What we're trying to do here is look at what might be some of the dividends, and they are unintentional, of course, that Beijing might be able to reap from this conflict. Let's start with the first question, Lun Tian. What does this war mean for major power relations? And I ask because Trump might be going to China soon, but then America's mind might be elsewhere.
Yeah, so the Iran conflict has made an already complicated China-US relations even more complicated. 2 main points to unpack here. The first main point is that it distracted the US from focusing on China. A direct impact of this conflict is that it led to President Donald Trump postponing his trip to China by 5 or 6 weeks, he says, because it would look so wrong for him to be welcomed with full pomp and pageantry in Beijing while American soldiers are dying in the Middle East. China definitely wants this summit. Beijing has said that when the two leaders meet and conduct what it calls leaders' diplomacy, it can serve as a guiding star for stable China-US relations. Analysts expect the summit to lock in an extension of the current truce on tariffs and export controls, which in turn would have helped stabilize global trade. So from China's perspective, the delay is not ideal. But if we were to make lemonade out of lemons, a delay can give both sides some time to prepare for the summit and to have more deliverables. So the first point is that the US is distracted from China. And a second and indirect point about how the conflict could impact China-US ties is that it has strained America's relations with its allies. Mr. Trump launched the war with very little consultation, found himself stuck in a crisis in the Straits of Hormuz, and called on allies in NATO and Asia to help secure shipping lanes. Americans' allies cannot be too happy about this. They are already dealing with the economic fallout from higher oil prices caused by the conflict that they did not start, and now they are being asked to help clean up the mess. This help is not something that they can give easily, because their ships could be hit by Iranian drones, and they face strong domestic opposition to being dragged into a distant war. Such tension between the US and its allies would probably be in China's favor. On top of that, the US has already moved some military assets from Asia to the Middle East, such as Marines from Japan, parts of the THAAD missile defense system from South Korea. That makes allies uneasy and likely makes Beijing a little more comfortable. From China's perspective, every interceptor sent to the Gulf is one less pointed at the Taiwan Strait.
I've been hearing this term leaders diplomacy quite often in in the last month or so. Can you tell us a bit more? Why are the Chinese so fixated on this particular aspect of diplomacy? I mean, isn't when we talk about diplomatic interactions, isn't the top level interaction always the one that gives the most dividends?
Yeah. So I think China, having dealt with Trump 1.0 in his first term, and then the first year of Trump in office, the trade war, Liberation Day, and all that, China has drawn a conclusion that it's probably better to deal with Trump than to deal with the Congress or some of the strategic security advisors that are in the DC. So Trump being very transactional and in a way quite eager to strike deals when it benefits him, it makes him it makes it easier for China to plan what to give to US and to get something in return. Whereas if there is no leaders diplomacy and China as a country is left to deal with US as a country, and US as a country is also partially driven by what its Congress says and wants to do, then China could find itself facing a more hawkish force.
Can we now talk a little bit about the war and its impact on China's economy, Lun Tian? Do you see any bright spots here?
Okay, so economically, in the short term, the war is bad for almost every country in the world, including China, with the possible exception of Russia. Higher oil prices will raise freight costs, squeeze manufacturers, and risk turning China's long-running deflation problem into what some would call a bad inflation, meaning prices are rising not because the demand is strong, but because the imported inputs have become more expensive. And then there is a second problem. The war does not just hit China's economy directly, it hits everybody else's too. So when other countries' growth slow down, they buy fewer Chinese exports, which then come back to hurt China.
I have a follow-up question on how this affects China's economy. I mean, China is a major green tech exporter, as we know. If across the board, countries are now waking up to the fact that they might need to move away a little bit from their reliance on fossil fuels, is it good for Chinese companies who deal in, for instance, solar panels or windmills?
Yes, you seem to have found the bright spot for China economically for this war. So the crisis has reminded the world how risky it is to be over-dependent on fossil fuels, and this could push them towards green energy. And guess what? China happens to be a big seller of competitively priced solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. So buy from China.
And with this war now, like you said earlier, nobody is really looking closely at the tariff issue in America. Is this going to be to China's advantage somehow?
I think China has concluded, especially after the Supreme Court ruling, which invalidated Mr. Trump's emergency powers to impose tariff. China has concluded that Trump is going to impose tariffs one way or another. And so whether or not there is this Iran war and whether or not Trump's attention is on this for now, the tariffs is going to be on the table. And it will be something that the two leaders will talk about, or rather the working levels officials will talk about it, and then the two leaders may announce some kind of truce when they meet. So although the security people are focused on fighting the war, I'm sure the people who are like Mr. Besant and Mr. He Lifeng on the Chinese side, they are still thinking very hard about trade and tariffs.
Before all this happened, right, Iran was seen as a important logistical node in the Belt and Road Initiative because it connects Central Asia, Middle East, and Europe. So now that there is a war there, what are the alternatives for China when we talk about the BRI?
I suppose China's Belt and Road Initiative has always been a nodal and multimodal kind of network, which means it's on land, air, and sea, and it's also on the traditional Silk Road in the maritime, and then in the land part over Middle East, Central Asia to Europe. So there are many links that China can use, and if one fails, then China will try to just open up more elsewhere. And Middle East in general there's the risk, or the security risk, the geopolitical risk there has always been known and probably have been factored into the calculations for the Chinese firms there. So now it's just a matter of maybe shifting more priority elsewhere.
The buzzword for these few weeks, right, is energy security, and the topic that we covered in our last podcast back in January. And now that war is no longer a hypothetical scenario, how bad are things for China on the energy front?
When the war almost blocked the Strait of Hormuz, it hurts China, but there is a silver lining. How it hurts China is that China relies heavily on imported oil, and more than half of these imports normally come from the Middle East. But the silver lining is that China has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of shock. It has built up large oil stockpiles, often estimated at around 3 months of supply. It has also reduced its reliance on oil by building more coal power plants, speeding up electrical vehicle adoption, and diversifying its energy mix with renewables. Some analysts now describe China as an electrostate, which is still exposed to oil but much less hostage to oil than before. And the silver lining looks more bling-bling when we compare China with its East Asian neighbors. Japan and South Korea are more heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil than China. About 70% of their oil imports come through the Strait of Hormuz, whereas only roughly half of China's come through. So China can also get oil from Russia and Central Asia via overland pipes, which is around 2 million to 2.5 million barrels per day. This is an option that Japan and Korea simply do not have. Another advantage that China has is political. Iran has reportedly treated Chinese-linked shipping as non-hostile vessels and signaled that it would allow them to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Reports also suggest that while global tanker traffic has stalled, so-called shadow fleet vessels are still moving roughly about 1.4 million barrels per day of Iranian crude to China's independent or teapot refineries. So yes, the Iran conflict hurts China's energy security, but China is not nakedly exposed and is comparatively better off than its neighbors. So it is like when there is a sudden downpour, everybody on the street gets drenched, but China is wearing a raincoat, still wet, just less miserable than the others.
I like the way you describe it, but I want us to talk a little bit more about the Straits of Hormuz blockade, because there's been so much talk, speculation on convoy, maybe a US-led one, right, to protect the tankers. If there is such a convoy, do you think China would join? Assuming it is American-led, of course.
I should say never. The possibility is very low. So why would China put its own ship at risk when it's still able to get some oil? And China would definitely prefer the strait to be reopened, certainly, but preferably by diplomacy or someone else's navy.
But if China doesn't join, I mean, wouldn't it look bad? Because the idea is for China to look like a responsible member of the global community. If everyone is jumping onto that bandwagon and China says, no, I'm not doing it, how will this affect the way people look at China and its position in the world?
Yeah, I suppose if you argue this way, China's global image may take a slight hit because it has made such a big show of its global governance initiative, global security initiative, all of which talks about, managing conflict through peaceful dialogue, respect for sovereignty, having ceasefire. It has also called for ceasefire. But for all that it says, it just cannot do anything to stop the war. And so the gap between China's rhetoric as a responsible major power and its actual leverage is stark. But I don't think Beijing needs to be too worried about this, because look at America's global image and what a big hit that it has gotten from this war. So by comparatively, I don't think people are pouncing on China on this.
I want to switch the topic to the military side of things, Tian. What might some of the lessons be for China?
Yeah, I would imagine China military analysts would probably be watching the conflict very closely for any lessons that they can draw. I suppose one lesson could be they would see that the US is capable and willing to carry out so called decapitation operations, which means that they can take out political leaders in their home turf. They had already proved that they could do that with the capture of the Venezuelan president Maduro, and they have proved it again with the killing of the Iranian supreme leader and with the other military figures, with the help of Israeli intelligence. I suppose the question Beijing might want to ask itself is, would it be able to protect itself from such operations? But that's something that we would not know. The second lesson that maybe China can draw from watching the war is how fast the war can burn through munitions. So if you use expensive interceptors to shoot down relatively cheap drones and missiles, very soon you quickly run out of your stockpile. And I suppose the third lesson is choke points matter. A country that depends on imported energy through narrow waterways has a strategic vulnerability, no matter how advanced its military looks on paper. So maybe one question that China might be asking itself is, what is the equivalent of the Strait of Hormuz that it has? If it's not something geographic, then could it be something that is in the form of, say, rare earths or some other thing that the rest of the world needs and cannot do without?
In one of your live blog posts, you mentioned that what happened in Iran is a reminder of American military power. So based on what China has seen, would it change its thinking in terms of deciding whether to take back Taiwan or not? Because that is something that has been quite hotly debated.
I'm afraid my answer is still the same as the last time we chatted, which is that the decision to take back Taiwan is a political rather than a military decision. So from Beijing's point of view, even if it is very confident militarily that it can do it, it will probably only do it when there's no peaceful way to do so, because the risk of a failed military operation is just too huge and it's probably existential for the Communist Party. So I would imagine, yes, they would be watching this carefully, but still it would boil down to a political decision.
When it comes to Iran, China has provided advanced technology, from its Beidou navigation satellite system that helps to guide Iranian missiles, right, and anti-stealth radar to detect Western aircraft. And based on Iran's capabilities in the war so far, what are military analysts saying in terms of how helpful the Chinese technology has been?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, and I think the verdict is a bit still out there. On one side, the military analysts are arguing that this Iranian conflict has been a live laboratory for Chinese military hardware, because China not having gone to war for many decades. This is, having the hardware that is supplied to other countries and other countries fighting the war is almost like a proxy place for China to test out its hardware. So China's Beidou 3 navigation system and the advanced anti-stealth radars, they have enabled Iranian forces to track America's F-35s and strike Western bases with precision. So that seemed to be a score on the Chinese side for that one. But there are also hits and misses. China's high-end defense system, the HQ-9B, couldn't always evade Israeli jamming. So all in all, I think analysts say Beijing isn't doing too badly, but it's not exactly clear, because even though Iran uses Chinese technology or hardware, how it puts all these systems together and the people that it trains to operate the system can also affect the effectiveness of the systems. So if, let's say, Iranian air defense system wasn't able to prevent US and Israeli missiles from taking out its leaders, does it mean that the Chinese air defense system is bad? So it's hard to say for sure without us looking at the data. And we can't have the data because we are not them. But one potential benefit that Beijing can get out of this is without getting its hands dirty, without getting into the fight physically, it potentially can harvest combat hardened data on American electronic warfare and radar signatures. And this intelligence could be applied to future potential conflict in Southeast Asia and the Taiwan Strait.
To be clear, we are not advocating for conflict as a positive force for China. But now that we've explored some of the silver linings or possible silver linings, we should go back towards the mainstream, I think, and look at the really difficult issues for China. And if you take a step back, ultimately Beijing had very little leverage to stop things from going downhill drastically. And in terms of China's global image, if you look at it in terms of a scorecard, how is China looking right now?
Yeah, we discussed this earlier. So China's global image might have taken a slight hit because it was seen as saying a lot but not being able to do anything effective. But compared to the US, maybe it's not that bad. And yeah, you always just, when the tiger is chasing you, you just have to run faster than the next guy next to you. So this is the logic.
China wants to be a leader of the global south, right?
Yeah.
So with what's happened in Iran, can it still be trusted by the global south?
In the case of Iran, China not doing much might make it look a bit weak in that it didn't seem to have the capability to do it. But I think many other countries also recognize that China also doesn't really need to do much because it's not ideologically aligned with its partners. It's more a pragmatic arrangement between China and many of these other partners. And so therefore, they wouldn't expect China to jump to the defense of Iran like how, say, they might expect, say, US to come to the defense of Europe. That's in the past. So therefore, in a way, what China's inaction in Iran's case is somewhat expected and understood by other countries.
In terms of China's influence in the Middle East, right, I almost forgot that it managed to broker the Iran-Saudi Arabia deal and the Palestinian unity talks, and that was only in 2024, right? But suddenly it seems like it's such a distant and almost not so relevant memory right now. So are the days of China acting as a mediator in the Middle East gone forever?
I wouldn't say it's gone forever, and probably when times are more peaceful, China can again take up the role as mediator. But yeah, I suppose now that when missiles are flying, there's really not much China can do. It has never had a practice of sending boots to the ground to a hot conflict area. So right now, its toolbox is also looking much smaller than the Americas. It does not have the alliance network. It doesn't have the military footprint all over the world. It doesn't have the coercive leverage that Washington has. So, well, China can broker détente, but just is a much less convincing firefighter.
One of the things that we haven't really touched on today is the recent Liang Hui, at the beginning of the month. Can we perhaps spend some time dissecting the official lines on Iran? What do they say about China's positions and constraints? Let's start with what are your views in terms of how Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi handled the Iran issue, at his yearly foreign policy press conference?
Yes. So the Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the press conference during Liang Hui, when he was asked about the Iranian war, he said that was a war that should never have started. Without naming the US, he opposes this action to infringe the sovereignty of another country and said that brute force, a hard fist, doesn't equate to moral justice.
But I wish he spelled out China's bottom line more starkly, or sounded the alarm in a bigger way. What is your view on this? And I promise this will be the last question.
I would imagine that it's hard he's actually in a tight spot, right? Because he has to say something about the situation, but in actual fact, China really cannot do much about the situation. So that is only so much he can say. He had a call with the Iranian foreign minister yesterday, and he repeated the same line about how this war should stop as soon as possible, and the Iranian foreign minister thanked him for providing humanitarian assistance. So this is the kind of thing that China can do. It can provide humanitarian assistance, but it cannot really stop the war from fighting.
And I'm afraid we are almost running out of time. If you ask me, I think China has encountered more than its fair share of geopolitical headwinds. In the first quarter of 2026, I felt like it was a bystander in Venezuela and now Iran. So in terms of exercising global leadership and influence, maybe Beijing wasn't able to flex its muscles very much. There were hopes for some kind of deal with the US later this month on tariffs, but it now looks like there will be more waiting and hedging involved. But make no mistake about it, the Americans are fully engaged in Iran and the Straits of Hormuz, and it will be an expensive undertaking for them, and that will consume a lot of their bandwidth. But whether this might open up more foreign policy space for China in the future, I suppose, is anyone's guess. This is an Asian Insider podcast. I'm Albert Wai. Don't forget to share this with your friends and family. You can also sign up for our Asian Insider newsletter. Our episode was recorded on the 25th of March 2026, and it was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.